Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Chapter 7 lecture. Let me go ahead and put this over here so we can see it. Hello, I hope everybody is doing all right today on this beautiful day. Let me check in and see who I have. I have Brianna. Hi, Erin. Javier, Sydney, Alana, Monica, Daniela, Antonio, and Alexis. Hello, welcome. I hope that you are working on or have finished your midterm. So if you have not yet, good luck on it. If you have, I'm sure you did wonderfully especially because you guys are a group that I see in lecture a lot. So I'm very sure that you guys did just fantastically. So, I'm a little crooked today, and I can't quite figure out why, but this is just how it's going to be today. It's a Tuesday. So we're going to go ahead and start with Chapter 7. Chapter 7 is all about listening, receiving, and responding as per the usual with the way that we start our lectures. We are going to start with defining the term that we're working with, which is listening in this situation. And then we're going to go forward and talk about the different styles of listening, as well as how listening as a skill is important to you as a communicator. So let's dive right in. So what is listening? Why is it an important task? It's actually something that we do far more than we do engaging in verbal communication. Listening tends to be 27.5% of our total communication time. 27.9% of that is media listening, meaning that listening to music or listening to to TV or any other type of mass media as well. So we listen on a very common basis, but we don't really understand how listening works. And so we're going to, let me pull this over here. We're going to define listening first. And listening is the process, and note the word process, of receiving and responding to other people's messages. This process word is carried over from Chapter 1 when we talked about the communication model, and we talked about it as this process of mutual influence, because listening is obviously a part of that. Listening in and of itself is also a process. That would make sense. One of the things I want to clarify is that it is not the same as hearing. So we all know that we could hear something, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we are able to receive it and respond to someone else's message. Hearing just means that it is physiologically hitting your ear and you are aware that there is some sort of sound, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're giving it that cognitive attention where we would define it as listening. Listening is the most common behavior at work. People at work tend to listen far more than they do actually speak. It's an important part of relational satisfaction. Going back to Chapter 6, we learned about the importance of nonverbal communication and how nonverbal communication is primarily relational, meaning that we use it to help us define what type of relationship we want to have with other people. And one of the key things in that endeavor is listening. When you are listening, you're not talking, obviously, but you are showing someone else I'm listening by nodding your head, by giving them eye contact. And so this idea really transfers over well from Chapter 6 on how important it is that we engage in listening from a relational standpoint, because it really helps us develop our relationships in a positive way. Again, not the same as hearing, so these 3 bullet points are quite important for understanding the definition of listening. So listening is not automatic. We assume that if we hear something, then that means we've listened to it, but that's very rarely the case. We engage in mindless listening, which is when we react to messages automatically without really giving them mental investment. One example is when you go to the store and the clerk behind the counter says, "Hello, how's your day going?" Your automatic response is, "Good, how's yours?" Or, "Good, my day's going good." And you have these kind of cookie cutter responses that you give to them, because in that moment your mind is just kind of going into cruise control, and it's just saying what you normally would say, regardless of whether or not it's accurate or it's what you're really feeling. And that's mindless listening. And that usually is helpful, even though it sounds terrible. It could be helpful because remember that we can't pay attention to every single thing that we hear on a regular basis and give it our full cognitive attention and energy. We learned this in chapter 4 when we learned about perception. And during the perceptual process, we talked about how we select, right? We pick things that we want to perceive or pay attention to based off their contrast, intensity, or repetition. Those were the 3 that we talked about. And so because of that, we understood from chapter 4 that we can't just spend our time paying attention to every single thing that is said to us, because otherwise we would be quite tired at the end of the day, and we would be exerting a lot of cognitive effort for maybe things that are not that important to us. So mindless listening can be helpful at times when we just don't care about the message that we're listening to. That could also include media listening. So maybe you're watching TV and you're cleaning your house and some commercials go on. You know the commercials are going on and you're sort of paying attention to them, but you're not really giving them that mental investment. And maybe you don't really want to, because those are products that you're not interested in, or products that you don't really care about or that you won't buy. And so it makes sense that we would engage in mindless listening for things that we just don't want to have investment in. The opposite end of that spectrum right here is mindful listening. And this is when we try to give careful, thoughtful attention to the responses that we receive, meaning that we've paid our utmost attention to the message, whatever it is, and we're crafting a message in response. And that is the highest level of listening, because that involves not only physiologically hearing something, but the listening component of being able to receive, deconstruct the message, and respond. In communication studies, we don't define listening as just being able to receive a message. We define it as being able to also respond to the message. So ultimately, if you hear a message and you are trying to mindfully listen and you receive it, but you don't understand the message and you don't know how to respond to it, then that means you were not mindfully listening. That means purely that if you cannot understand a message, we don't consider that completely engaging in the listening process. Of course, let's say someone says something that's very abstract, you understand bits and pieces of it, and you understand that you don't understand it, and you ask a question as your response to it, we still consider that listening, because you are recognizing that you can't understand certain bits and pieces of it and you're asking for clarification. But in the rare occasions where we take in a message and we don't understand 100% of it and we can't respond, that's still not considered listening. So just want to clarify that. So we have a couple listening styles, and all of us kind of play into these different styles depending on the roles that we engage on in our lives, at your work, at home, whether you're a parent or not, a sibling, whether or not you're a younger or older sibling might play into this as well, what type of classes that you're in. And so you might play a little bit more or less of these different listening styles, but we all engage in them. So the first one up here you see in brown is the task-oriented listening. This is when we're concerned with, what do I have to do? Tell me what I need to do. And this is usually when your boss, your supervisor, your manager is giving you instructions. And so you are engaging in task-oriented listening because you are concerned with accomplishing a goal. You want to finish a job. You want to do something that's task-oriented listening. Usually in task-oriented listening, that means your brain is set to follow steps. So you're looking for steps. You're hearing, you're trying to pick up instructions like do this first, do this next, or you're trying to pick up clues on efficiency. You're trying to listen to what the other person is saying in regards to the best way to get a job done or a goal completed. Task-oriented listening is also what you engage in your classes when you are listening to your instructor giving out instructions on how to complete an assignment, or if they're giving instructions on how to do an activity. That's also task-oriented listening. Going down the list, relational listening is focused on building emotional closeness with others. So very much unlike task-oriented listening where there's a goal, right? There's a clear start to finish to task-oriented listening, because if I'm listening for my boss, I'm trying to get some sort of instruction from them, ultimately those instructions will end, and then I will leave with all that information that they have provided me and then go do that job. With relational listening, there's really no definite start or finish, because in relational relational listening, what you're doing is you're just trying to build, as it says right here, the relationship between you and that other person. Sometimes you and your friend might be talking, your friend has had a terrible day, and they just need to vent about how terrible their day was. There might not be a clear start and end to that, but you're listening to them because you want to build that relationship with them. And so in relational listening, there's not this goal of trying to figure out, well, let me hear about your bad day and how I can fix it. And relational listening is just let me hear about your bad day, right? Because I want to hear about your bad day or your good day. It can also be positive things when people are sharing good things that have happened with them and you want to hear about it. That's also a form of relational listening as well. But unlike task-oriented listening, there is no set goal or thing to fix or thing to do when it comes to listening. So then we go into analytical listening. This is when we are trying to take in a full message and purely understand it before we give our opinion, our critique of it. So this is when we're trying to consider all sides of a different message. For example, if it's an election year and you want to hear both candidates speak, you might hear them first using analytical listening, where you're not really there just to criticize their message, but you're there just to try to take in what they're saying, what their policies are, what their plan is. And then afterwards, you might engage in critical listening, which is when you do evaluate it or you put your perspective or your opinion on someone's message. So, for example, if a friend comes to you looking for advice, right? They're asking you, what should I do in this situation? You might start with analytical listening where you just hear what they have to say. You try to understand it fully before giving your critique. And then afterwards, when they ask you, okay, I have these choices. I can either do choice A, choice B, or choice C. Then you would engage in critical listening where you evaluate which choice or which piece of advice you want to give them. And so the biggest difference between analytical and critical is that critical is the only type of listening where you are evaluating a message. And analytical listening, you're just trying to purely understand it fully and completely with no criticism, no opinions, no judgment on it. Okay? And it's always interesting to see what type of style you employ. Actually, online, I have a little survey that you can take that helps you identify what type of listening style you engage in the most. So if you want to know, you can go ahead. It's an interactive survey. It's really fun. And you can just go in and see what type of listening do I usually employ the most. College students actually spend about 55% of their time listening, which is kind of cool when you think about it. College students listen the absolute most because of course you do. You sit in class, you listen to your peers, you listen to your instructors, your counselors, and you are great listeners. And I want you to always remember that because I think that's a great skill to bring into any job and any job interview, to say that you're a great communicator, and a big piece of that means that you're a great listener that is able to receive and respond to messages. So, there's a couple challenges, as you might expect, that come along with listening. It's not easy. Even for the best of us, we try our best to listen to people, and we don't always succeed. And what are the common reasons for this? What are the barriers? And so the first one is information overload. Sometimes we get too much coming at us all at once, and it can be really overwhelming. For any of you that have tried to go to the doctor or the pharmacist, and the doctor and the pharmacist are giving you instructions, and the nurse is also giving you instructions, and they're really trying to make sure that you have all the information you need. For some people, it might be information overload because they're like, wait, I have to take this medication, and then I have to do it at this time, and then I also have to watch this wound and make sure it doesn't turn this color, and then they might just become so overwhelmed with that information that they actually don't take it in or listen to it effectively because for them it's information overload. It's way too much information. What happens when we get too much information thrown at us? Automatically we go into mindless listening, as we talked about in the previous slides, and that just kicks in. And it gets really hard for us to listen mindfully, and we rather listen mindlessly, which is where we do still stay engaged in the conversation. We're just not mindful anymore of our listening at that moment. This also occurs, of course, when you are just provided with too much stuff in class. So sometimes you might be presented with lots of information in a classroom during a lecture. I know that I give you a lot of information, and that's also a lot of information overload possibilities happening there. And so, for example, that's why I want to make sure I give you those outlines where I outline and organize the information for you so it's a little bit more digestible. That's why I always suggest to students to never try to sit down and read a full chapter all at once, because you may not actually recall anything after that. I think splitting it up into 2 or 3s or 4s or whatever works for you is better, because you're kind of gnawing away at material little by little rather than overloading yourself with information and making it really hard for yourself to engage further with the material. And not just for my class, I'd say that would go for any class truly on information overload, particularly classes like biology, like chemistry, that have a lot of information in them. It's always good for you to tackle those things little by little every single day, instead of trying to do them all at once, because we know as researchers that information overload automatically makes you kick in to mindless listening. Okay, so we also have personal concerns. We all have lives, and we all have things that we are worrying about, and so those definitely can be a source of listening barrier, because we maybe want to listen in class or listen at work, and we might be having a really hard time doing that because we're distracted by our own personal problems, matters that are more important to us than the messages that other people are sending. We also have rapid thought. Our brains can actually think quite a lot faster than we can speak. So if you've ever said something that you regret saying, or something stupid or dumb or silly, and as you're saying it, your brain is like, no, don't say it, but you can't stop yourself and you're already saying it. That's because of rapid thought, where we have this little gap of time between how fast our brain can process and how quickly our mouths can talk. So we might, as our brains might send a signal to our mouths to say something, and then our brain, because it thinks far faster than our muscles here can move, is like, wait, no, I shouldn't say that. But by that time, this is a little slower, and it is already saying the thing that you don't want to say. And so rapid thought is a great reason for that, because sometimes we are thinking so quickly, we either are worried about what we're saying and we're only paying attention to what we're saying, or we are completely in our own world because we're wrapped up in our thoughts and not paying attention to what the other person is saying. And so rapid thought definitely impedes careful and mindful listening, because our brains are so active. They're going thousands of miles a minute sometimes. And the brain works so fast that you end up getting into maybe sometimes trouble, saying things that you wish that you want to pump the brakes on, but you can't yet, because of rapid thought. And the last one is noise. This, of course, should be very familiar to you. It comes from our Chapter 1 lecture on what are the things that impede a communication interaction. So if you go back to Chapter 1, you look at that little communication model. Noise is all those squiggly lines that you see in that model. And it's distractions, right? Distractions from our physical and our mental world. Either noise from our surrounding area. If something's too loud, it distracts you from listening to what's directly in front of you that you probably should be listening to. But we also have mental distractions. We're daydreaming, or we are off in our own little world sometimes. And so noise can be both internal within us and external in our environment. But regardless, it definitely negatively affects our listening. One of the key things I want you to remember is that all listeners do not receive the same message. We often think that if we send out a message to one person, and then we send it out to another person, that they're going to receive it the exact same way. And that's definitely not the case. We should never ever assume that, because all listeners are different. As we talked about in Chapter 3, all of us have a different self-concept, right? None of us are the same. All of us are products of our social comparisons, our reflected appraisals, and everything that we have developed from our identities, which we learned about in Chapter 2, our cultural, social, in-group identities. And so because of that, we cannot receive the same message all the time. What we hear from one person might sound great to us, and then to a friend, it might sound terrible. And so that's because, as you can see here, I put in these colors: physiological factors, social role, cultural background, personal needs, personal interest and needs, shape and distort, which means change, the raw data or the actual words that we're hearing into different messages. And if this sounds familiar, again, we learned this all in chapters 1 through 4, as you can see right here. These are important things to remember because this is what helps us understand as communicators. Why is it that when I watched that politician speak, I thought their speech was incredible, and when my friend watched them speak, my friend thought that they were terrible? And that really helps us here. This slide really helps us understand and remember that all of these different factors right here in the colors help us to read into and listen to messages in a variety of different ways. And so our social roles, our cultural backgrounds, our personal interests, all of that will always dictate how we take in a message and digest it. And we all engage what we call poor listening habits. So we have those obstacles, as we talked about in the previous slide, but we also engage in behavioral habits that literally become ingrained in our communication style over time that we really have to become aware of and try to knock these habits as soon as possible, because they're not productive to having a positive, mindful listening engagement with other people. So the first one is pseudo-listening. This is when someone pretends that they're listening, but they're actually not. And we have all been guilty of this. We've all been like, and we're completely off in our own other world. We're victims of our internal noise where we're thinking about what we want for lunch and because we're hungry, and we are just going, and we're not really listening to what that other person's saying. But we know that it's important relationally to show that other person, yes, I'm listening to you. And so we'll engage in nonverbal behaviors to pretend like we are, but we're really not. Which is interesting because if we pseudo-listen, that means that we're quite aware that listening is an important relational component. So that's always funny to think about. The second one is stage hogging. You have all met a stage hogger. I feel like we've all met one in our lives. This is a person that is only interested in what they want to say. And so because of that, they will interrupt, they'll override your conversation. You might have something to say and they'll be like, wait, I have something to say too. And they will dominate or stage hog the conversation completely. And it can get very frustrating because they're not engaging in listening at all, but the expectation from their side is that you listen to what they're saying. So it's a little one-sided. You also can engage in selective listening. This is when you only respond to pieces of the message that interest you or that are important to you, and you forget everything else. So if you've ever told someone, wow, you really took that out of context, they're probably practicing selective listening, because that is what happens when you take things out of their context. And if we've learned anything in this class, context is of utmost importance. So you can't take things out of context. So you can't selectively listen. You can't kind of cherry pick and choose the things that you want to pay attention to or respond to, because then obviously you're ignoring the rest of the message, right? This tends to happen in conflicts as well, in fights. People will kind of cherry pick the things that they want to hear from you, and then they'll build upon that rather than responding to the full thing that you've said. More listening habits that we get into. Filling in the gaps. This is when we are not completely paying attention and listening, and so we try to recall a story or recall an event that we don't fully remember because we weren't listening very critically at the time. And so we will make up information and fill in the gaps as much as possible to try to make it seem like, oh yes, I know exactly how this story went. I can totally tell you the full story right now. But really they're just filling in the gaps with information that they think happened because they don't remember the story completely because they were not listening, right? But we do this because we want to give this impression like, yeah, I got it. I got it all. Got it. Don't worry. And it's usually when they want to end the conversation as well. Insulated listening is when listeners protect themselves and they just avoid what they don't want to deal with. So when you are trying to have, for example, a very serious conversation with your romantic partner about finances, which tends to be the very key thing that couples fight the most over. They might engage in insulated listening, where they just don't want to deal with it, they don't want to address it, they don't want to engage with you about it, so they just avoid it completely. And so they might be in the room with you, and you might be talking to them about finances, and they will insulate or protect themselves mentally, so they will not engage with you in that conversation. They will not listen to what you're saying because they would rather just avoid it because they're not comfortable with it. Defensive listening is when someone takes innocent comments as personal attacks, right? So this is when you are in a mindset where you're already defensive, and so anything that someone says, you're going to take defensively. We've all been victims of that, and sometimes perpetrators of that. Ambushing is listening carefully, but only to gather information to later attack the speaker. We have all been in a conversation or a conflict where we say something, and someone says, "Oh, so this is how it's going to be then." And then they ambush you, they pick out things that you're going to say, and then use that information, flip it upon you, and attack you with it, right? And so again, it's very similar to selective listening, but it's more aggressive than selective listening, because in selective listening, you're not necessarily selectively listening just to attack the other person, whereas ambushing, you are picking out things that you want to use so that you can attack the person later when they're done talking. This is a clip from Saturday Night Live. I really encourage you to watch it. It features the character Penelope. There's a picture of her right here, and there's a link right here that you can click on, or you can just Google Saturday Night Penelope Therapy. And the whole scene is about her going to a group therapy session, and in that group therapy session, she displays a lot of poor listening habits, one of them being stage hogging. And one of the things I want you to pay attention to is, how does that affect the other people in the group, right? How does her poor listening affect the therapy group, affect how others see her, and affect how others communicate as well? Because it does definitely interrupt the interactions at hand. So it's always a good thing to observe, so you can kind of see how these poor listening habits play out in actual conversations. Oops, excuse me. So there are 5 elements of mindful listening. We talked about poor listening habits. We talked about the obstacles to good listening. Now let's talk about, we talked about bad listening and what it is. Let's look at good listening and what that is. And so one of the first things we have to remember is that mindful listening has these 5 components, and they have to be achieved in order for us to engage in mindful listening successfully. So the first one is the physiological aspect. You have to be able to hear that person. You can't engage in mindful listening if you're talking to someone over the phone and the phone is breaking up and you can't even hear what they're saying. And so that first step, that physiological step, is an important one, because you cannot take in a message if you don't have that physiological response of hearing it yet. Then you have attending. So remember, if this sounds familiar, this comes from chapter 4. The very first step in the selection process is to select or attend to things that you want to pay attention to. In chapter 4, that meant everything, so visually, auditory, everything. But here, attending refers to the psychological process where you choose to listen, and you select, I'm going to pay attention to you and your message right now. We don't always do this. We all know that we don't always do this. When do we do it and why? I'm going to move myself around here. There you go. I don't know why I made this more complicated than I need to. So we attend most carefully when there's payoff. If we are at work and we're super bored and we just don't want to be there, we might not be paying attention readily to everything around us. However, let's say someone from HR comes by and is like, hey, I'm collecting some opinions about pay raises. You're like, what? Pay raises? And you are suddenly paying attention very well, right? You went from 0 to 10 very quickly on your listening scale, because there's payoff for us. And payoff can mean a lot of things. It can mean material things like, money, or if I listen to this, then I can get a house, or if I listen to this, then I can do this and that and that. It might be actual material success, but payoff can also mean relational success. So I listen to my romantic partner because for me the payoff is them being happy, and that's something that I want. Does that make sense? So payoff in this situation just means anything that we actually care about, that we think will be a reward for our good listening. And one of the key things we have to remember when we do attend, when we do that psychological choice to pay attention to something, we have to make sure that we're paying attention to both the nonverbal cues and the words that someone is saying as well. At times we might zero in completely on just the verbal conversation that someone is giving us, and we are not paying attention to or listening to with our eyes the person's nonverbal behaviors as well. And so very important then that we try to screen out distractions. We try to set an environment where we have the highest chance of success when it comes to trying to mindfully listen. All right. So far, we have talked about hearing as being the first step. The second step is attending, picking out things that we want to listen to, making that psychological choice to listen. The third one is understanding. And understanding, I want to kind of pump the brakes right now and say, I know that we all use the word understanding in our everyday language, but please remember that in communication studies, especially for this chapter, there is an actual definition of the word understanding, which I put here. These 3 bullet points are our social scientific definition of understanding. So please do not use your personal definition of understanding when you're approaching this chapter. Use these 3 bullet points or the textbook's definition, because that's what we're going to go by. Understanding means that you have the awareness of the rules of language, knowledge of the source of the message, and the context of the message. If you don't have these 3 factors, we as communication studies researchers say that you did not fully understand the message. And so let's go through what this means. Awareness of the rules of language means that you can understand the language that is being spoken. You understand, for example, if it's English, you understand the rules of English, you understand how English plays out, how it works, what verbs are, what pronouns are, all that kind of stuff. The second level is knowledge of the source of the message. You know who the message comes from and who they are as a person or organization or an entity. So for example, if you are watching a commercial and it is and it features an athlete, so let's say it features LeBron James, and he's telling you to drink Gatorade. I'm totally making this up. There's not really a commercial like this. You understand that he, as an athlete, is giving you this recommendation of you should drink Gatorade. You understand who he is, and you're taking that into account as you're listening to the message. So you might be like, wow, like he's an athlete and he drinks Gatorade. That's super credible to me. The fact that you know who he is, you understand the source of that message, it adds an additional layer to your ability to understand it. Source is also really important because there are certain things that if they come from different people, they have a little bit more weight to them, right? So let me give you an example. I have a class that I teach called small group communication. And in that class, we do a lot of, as you might imagine, group work where I put students into groups and they do month-long projects, presentations, things of that nature. Of course, there is sometimes 1 or 2 or 3 students in a group that do not contribute as much to other groups. And I'm sure you all can relate to that aspect, right? Where you're in a group project and you're not you're doing all the work because someone else is not doing the work. So sometimes the students in the group will say, hey, person who's slacking off, please make sure that you contribute more, that you show up on time to our meetings, or that you complete your work on time. We really need you to do that. It's important for our group grade. And so then they might change their behavior or they might not. But I've often noticed that when students approach me with the problem, and then I speak to the person who is slacking off, they stop slacking off really quickly. Why? Because they know me as the source of that message is different from a student with giving the same message, because I actually have the power to give them a grade. I have power in that situation, and so because they have knowledge of that source of the message, the way they react to it will be differently. And you'll see that depending on the type of person you're talking to or who is listening to you and who's not, sources really matter, because we like to think that everybody can say the same things and it has the same weight in the same power, but that's definitely not true, right? The last one is the context of the message. So the environment in which that message is being born into is very important. So if I am, as an instructor, giving you instructions on how to approach an assignment, that makes sense within the context of our class and are the goals of our class, but it doesn't quite make sense for someone else to step in and suddenly just give you instructions on how to do stuff, right? Context is super important. Also, context changes it. So if you and your significant other have been fighting for a really long time and now you're stepping into a new argument, that context is going to be brought into the new argument because all those emotional frustrations, all of that history of fighting is going to be brought into the new fight. If you and your significant other have been having a great time, you're getting along well, and then suddenly after 4 or 5 months you have one itsy bitsy fight, that fight might not blow up very bigly, right? Bigly, very largely. Bigly. Because when you are doing really well and then you have a little small fight, it might not be that much of an issue. But let's say you've been fighting for an extended period of time. You have one small fight that might blow up into a bigger fight simply because it's being born into the context of an already strained relationship. So context is incredibly important. Just as the source is. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is engage in, is achieve listening fidelity, which is the congruence between understanding what the sender is trying to communicate. What that means is congruence is a fancy word for being the same or being equal. And so listening fidelity just means, did I understand what you wanted me to understand? Like, did the message I take in, was it actually the message you wanted to take across? And we all know that ultimately we don't achieve listening fidelity all the time. We wish we did, right? I wish that when anyone said anything, I understood exactly what they wanted to say to me, precisely in the way that they said it, in the context of it coming out. But that's not always true because we wish we could engage in that, but we don't. But ultimately, that's what we should strive for. It's that golden standard for communicators. Do you achieve listening fidelity? Did you actually have congruence or equality or the same with what the person was trying to say and what you took away from the message? I want to state right here that that doesn't mean you agree with the person. A lot of students confuse listening fidelity with agreement. That doesn't mean you agree with them. It just means you understood their message as they meant it to be, as they meant to say it. So the last two components of listening, remembering and responding. This harkens back to the first definition that I gave you at the beginning of this lecture. Remembering is the ability to recall the information, so being able to actually recall it. That means that you can't engage in filling in the blanks, as we talked about in our previous list of bad listening habits. You actually had to listen and be able to recall something completely. And then responding is the final step. And remember at the very beginning of this lecture when I said it's not considered listening if you can't respond. That's why responding is that final step and the full piece of what we consider to be mindful, true listening. Excuse me. And so one of the things we have to remember is that this is when we provide feedback to the speaker. This is when we verbalize, hey, this is what I think you said. Hey, I think I got the message. Hey, wait, let me ask a question again. So the response is super important because it completes the listening process. If someone is pouring their heart out to you for like an hour and then afterwards when they're done, you have nothing to say to them, or you have nothing non-verbally to give them, like you don't give them a hug or you don't respond in any sort of way, either non-verbally or verbally, we don't consider that listening, because if you are not able to respond, what was that whole hour for, right? What was the relational bond that was built off of that? And remember that response is the key way that speakers know we were listening, right? And again, responding can be both nonverbal or verbal. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to say something. And sometimes you might not even say anything with actual content in it. You might be so surprised or so saddened by something that you might say, oh, wow, like I don't know what to say in this moment. But you're still providing feedback to the speaker and letting them know, hey, I did listen to you this whole time. I might need some more time to process it or something. But the response is really important. Okay, it has to happen. So now that we've gone through those 5 components of mindful listening, one of the key things we have to worry about is responding mindfully. And because that's responding is that very important final step, we have to break it down a little bit more and understand it with more detail, because as I reiterated just a moment ago, the response in listening is so crucial to complete the listening process. So how do we respond mindfully? The first one is paraphrasing, and I know that paraphrasing sounds very really, but it's so important because it restates the message, and most importantly, by doing so, you are providing the speaker an additional opportunity to clarify what they said. You are trying to summarize any facts, any information, details that were provided during the conversation, and you spit them back and you say, hey, this is what I took in. And it's so important to do that because not only does it check your knowledge, I've said this before and I'll say it again, one of the biggest ways we know something, like we know that we know it, is when we can explain it, right? So you might read about the listening process in chapter 7, but if you're able to explain it to someone else, that means you know it. And so paraphrasing is an example of that in our everyday conversations. If I'm able to paraphrase or repeat back to you what you said, that's a test for me to know that I know it, that I got what you said and I understood it, and I'm just giving you feedback on it. And then as the other person can then also check you. Once you paraphrase, maybe you might paraphrase something incorrectly, you might leave out an important detail, you might be emphasizing things that aren't as important to them. And so paraphrasing offers the other person an opportunity to say, oh, okay, you got like 75% of my message, here's the other 25% that I should clarify for you that you didn't get. And so it's a great way to not only develop a really strong relational bond with other people, because you're letting them know I was listening and I really want to make sure I got the message right. And I also really want to give you the opportunity to correct me if I'm not right. And all of that selflessness on your part when you are engaging in paraphrasing really shines through to the other person, and it really solidifies a very strong, good, healthy interpersonal bond. So how do you paraphrase? You can change the speaker's wording, you can offer an example of what you think they're talking about, or you can reflect on the underlying theme. You might say something like, so what I'm getting from this is that you're uncomfortable talking about finances. Is that right? Something like that, where you let the other person know, this is what I think the gist of your message is. And it's really cool to be able to get that back and forth from people when you offer to paraphrase their ideas and they respond to you. All right, so another type of listening response outside of paraphrasing is questioning. This is usually when you might not fully understand the message, but you definitely want to try. And so this is when you ask for extra information. What are you saying? What am I not understanding? How can I understand better? And the reasons to do this is to clarify meanings, learn about others' thoughts, feelings, and wants. Sometimes the other person might describe something that is happening to them, and you might want to know, well, how do you feel about that? And so you might ask, well, how does that make you feel? Or how did you react in that situation and why? So you might encourage them to speak more by asking these kinds of clarifying questions where you encourage them to elaborate, to discover, to talk more. Or you just want more facts and details, right? You want more from their story or from their conversation. Open questions are the type of questions that allow for different varieties of responses. So things like saying, how did you feel about that? Or why do you think you reacted that way? Or is this something you would like to see happen in the future, or why? Those are open responses because they allow someone to kind of craft an individual response however they want. Closed questions are usually yes and no. They limit possible answers. So if you want to say something like, do you want to talk about this more? They might say yes or no, right? Or they might not respond at all, which non-verbally might be a no. And so closed questions limit those answers, and those are sometimes helpful for finding out a baseline for how someone's feeling, as well as additional details that you might want to have. We also engage in counterfeit questions. This is when people try to throw you questions after the fact, to trap you, to make statements that carry hidden agendas that push correct answers, meaning the answers they want to hear. And it's usually based off unchecked assumptions, right? So, for example, this is a joke, but for example, I usually joke around with my friends when they say, "Hey, you look really nice today." And I might respond with a counterfeit question where I say, "Oh, do I not look nice every day? Are you saying I look ugly other days?" And of course, I'm joking. But that's an example of a counterfeit question where you're trying to trap the person. I'm clearly having the agenda of trying to make them uncomfortable. I'm trying to push some sort of right answer where they might fumble and be like, "No, I think you look nice all the time." And it's a fun joke that me and my friends have with each other. But there can be very serious counterfeit questions that you engage in, particularly at work. For example, if someone is engaging in a counterfeit question, they might be pushing you to try to say something or push you towards their agenda or their right answer. Okay. Empathizing is another example that we have talked about extensively in this book, and I love empathy so much as a source of building relational bonds. And this is when you're able to identify someone's emotions and perceptions. So in the paraphrasing and the questioning, you might be just asking for pure message clarification. I just need to know what your message is. What are you saying, right? Whereas here in the empathizing situation, you're looking for how are you feeling about it. You're much more focused on their emotions and perceptions. Not to say that you can't be when you question or when you paraphrase, but empathy is really kind of the end all be all of finding out someone's emotions and perceptions. And so listeners are not empathizing when they're doing the following things: denying others the right to their feelings. So when you tell someone you feel sad about that, that's stupid. You shouldn't feel sad about that. That's denying other people the right to their feelings. If someone is sad about something, then they have a right to be sad about it, right? We can't really dictate to other people how they should be perceiving or feeling things, because how they are perceiving and feeling things has just as much validity. We might help them negotiate how they feel about something. We might help them feel better about it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that their initial feelings are wrong, and that they should be denied. Definitely should not. The second one is minimizing the significance of the situation. This is when we try to put a silver lining on clouds, right? We try to say, like, well, it's not that bad because look at this. And usually that doesn't help the situation at all, because if someone's going through a bad time or something horrible has happened to them, putting a silver lining where, well, it's not that bad because look at this, that doesn't necessarily make them feel better. And it's actually a step away from empathy, because when you're trying to silver line something, when you're trying to make something seem better, when you're making it less significant, what you're doing is removing responsibility from yourself to engage in that, in empathy in that moment. Because if it's not that big of a deal, I guess I don't have to be empathetic because it's not that big of a deal, right? And so a part of it is also a focus on yourself, as which what we see here in this third bullet point. Sometimes when we are not being empathetic, it's truly because of our own issues. In addition to the various things that are going on in our head that is stopping us from being empathetic. And remember that empathy is a choice. It's a choice to be vulnerable with someone else, where you go where they're going emotionally, and you might not yourself want to do that yet. So we tend to protect ourselves by doing these various activities. The last one is raining on the speaker's parade. This is when someone is having a joyous and wonderful time, and we want to say things like, "Oh, you graduated? Well, the next difficult thing is finding a job, so good luck with that," right? We're trying to make anything that they are happy about, joyful about, worse than it really is, and not taking that time to empathize with them, find joy with them, celebrate with them in that moment. We also can engage in silent listening. I mentioned this earlier, and we're going to dive deeper into it now. You don't have to, as I said, always verbalize. I'm listening, right? A lot of it is nonverbal. And this is when you are attentive nonverbally. You're giving the eye contact, the head nods. You might be giving that person a hug. You might be holding them while they're talking. You might be tapping them on the shoulder. You might be doing a myriad of different nonverbal cues to let them know, hey, I'm paying attention to you. And silent listening is there to help other people solve problems. Because like I said, we all need to vent sometimes, and we all need a silent listener in our lives that will sit there and just listen to us, right? And let us get those things off our chest. Supporting is when you show solidarity with the other person's situation. And you can do this by these 5 different ways. You can agree. And so sometimes support doesn't necessarily mean you have to do something. It just means you agree. And so, for example, we have a lot of students who are dreamers on our campus, who are undocumented students who are pursuing their academic careers right now. And I had a dreamer student come to my classroom and give a presentation on their experience for my intercultural class. And afterwards, my intercultural class gave an agreement support where they said, oh, we support you, like we're really proud of what you're doing. We know this is really hard, but we think you can do it. And those verbal responses of agreement are a form of support because you're acknowledging that other person and what they're trying to accomplish or do or be or say. Supporting can also go to offering to help them, praising them, reassuring them, or diverting them. Sometimes we need someone to get our minds off things, right? So we'll go to that one person that always can bring us joy or always can distract us from what's happening. And all of these are different forms of support. And these are really beneficial when the support is sincere, right? We want it to be real from someone else. We don't really want to pour our heart out to someone who's like, oh, well, I'm sorry that happened to you. And they're kind of faking their way through supporting us. We want it to be sincere. We want it to be at a time when we can accept support. Remember that not everybody wants help all the time, right? Sometimes you might be having a really bad day and not want to talk to anyone. And if anyone tries to be like, let me talk to you, or tell me about your bad day, and they're kind of pushing their way into your life in that moment, you're just like, ugh, stop. And sometimes we're not in a mode mentally where we want to accept support. So remember that it goes the same way for the other person. They have to be in a mental space and place to accept your support, to want your support, any type of support. It's also important to focus on the here and now and then and there. Anytime you are giving advice to someone, listening to them, helping them, supporting them, never, ever, ever try to go to the then and there, to the back in the day, or, oh, I wish it was this way, or the shoulda, woulda, couldas. Don't play that with those people because it doesn't really help them in that moment. What good supporters do is they focus on the here and the now. What can we do right now to resolve your problem? What are our next steps? What can we do to move forward in the future? What is our present state? It's not healthy usually in those situations to focus on the past. The other person might want to vent about the past, right, as a source of pain for them, and you definitely should listen to that. But in the support that you provide, your offer to help, your praise, your reassurance should always be focused on the present, right now. Also really good when you're reading for consequences. When someone's asking you, hey, should I do this or should I do that? What you should be doing as a listener is, well, what are the consequences of doing that versus this? And that is a great form of support because you're helping that other person tease out their ideas and understand the consequences of their ideas. The last type of listening response we're going to go over today is analyzing. As we talked about, analyzing, this is when we're trying to learn someone else's message, understand what they're trying to say. However, an analysis can create more, as I put here in red, problems when your interpretation or your understanding of it is not accurate, causes confusion. Analysis also arouses defensiveness. When other listeners know that you're analyzing, right, that you're listening in, trying to fully understand every factor, every detail of their message, it can cause defensiveness, both in the speaker and the listener. And so when you are practicing analysis, where you're trying to understand someone's message, provide some sort of interpretation of their message, what you want to do is offer that interpretation in a tentative way, meaning that you don't say, I know for a fact this is what you said. You want to say something like, I think this is what you said. I think this is what you meant. This is how I understood your message. That's a better way to offer it tentatively, not absolutely as if you know you're 100% right? You have to also think, though, that you have a reasonable chance of being correct. You want your interpretation to be as accurate as possible, and you want, as with our previous issue of support, you want the other person to be receptive. You don't want to provide analysis, critique, interpretation to someone that isn't ready to have it, and you have to make sure that you really want to help the other person. Sometimes when we give advice to people, we always want to help the other person, and we hope that other people, when they're giving us advice, also are doing it with the intent of just helping us and not having some sort of other hidden agenda, as we've talked about in the previous slide as well. And so one of the things we have to remember, the difference between analysis and evaluating. I talked about that in the listening styles. I want to hit that right now on the point by saying that, remember, it's not the same as evaluating. Evaluating is when you appraise or give value to the person's message, okay? In analysis, you're just providing an understanding. This is how I interpret it. This is how I see your message. Evaluating is, this is how I see your message and it sucks, right? So it's providing that additional evaluation on it. It can be hurtful or negative, and it can be constructive as well. I have two examples here, as you can see. Something like, I told you so, or you asked for it, are negative evaluations that obviously usually don't promote a healthy environment or a healthy relationship, because all they do is just let the other person know that you were right, which in that situation isn't what they need to hear most of the time. It can be constructive by saying, yeah, you're on the right track, you're doing the right thing, I think that your choices are great. This is when I'm providing, again, my understanding, my opinion on your choices. Critical listeners evaluate messages given to them, and then they on the speaker's thoughts and actions. Very important, not on the speaker themselves. So now that we've talked about listening, let's kind of quickly recap all of the stuff that we've learned. We've learned about what listening is and why it's important. We've learned about why it is important to be mindful of the types of listening we engage in, especially if it's mindful listening or mindless listening. We also talked about the various obstacles to listening, such as information overload, and then we moved to the different styles of listening. Okay, sorry. I think I disconnected for a little bit, but I'm back on. I think I'm back on. I see Venora's question. I'm going to get to it. Aaron's question, I'm sorry. So Aaron has asked a question. How should we respond to a person who regularly uses selective listening? That's a good question, Aaron. When it comes to regularly using selective listening, right, they're picking out things that they want to hear. What you should be doing is, when they have responded, right, remember that you're also a listener in that situation as well, right? We're both listeners and receivers at the same time in any given context. So Aaron, what you should do is, once they have selectively listened to what you said and they respond to it, you should point out, hey person, I really think that you picked out only a few of the things that I said previously, and I really want to take this opportunity to give you more context and more information on the things I want you to focus on. And of course, if they refuse to do that, then disengage with that, conversation, because that's definitely not going to be a productive or a happy conversation. And so, Aaron, what you should always do is, when you do know that someone is selectively listening, point it out to them. And you can point it out to them and let them know, and ask them to paraphrase even. You can ask them for an evaluative message. You can ask them for more response and more feedback to verify that they're selectively listening, and then tell them, I think that you're only hearing bits and pieces of my message. Can I take another opportunity to give you the full message? And I would really like you to focus on it. Okay? That's a great question, though, to Aaron. Antonio asks, how do you reduce the amount of poor listening habits you have? That's a great question. So it depends on the type of listening habit you have. So some of us are more pseudo listeners, whereas some of us are more stay hoggers. It really depends on the type of poor listening habits you engage in. However, I would say, Antonio, the big key to that is self-monitoring. We talked about that in chapter 1, where you self-monitor or you watch yourself in an interaction to make sure that you are not engaging in the poor listening habits that you are trying to avoid. And also, if it's with a communication partner that you trust, so your best friend, romantic partner, family member, you can tell them, hey, I really want to make sure that I'm getting better, at talking with you and communicating with you and listening to you. So if you think I don't understand what you're saying, just let me know. Like, please tell me. And so if do that with someone that you trust, and they can definitely help you be a mirror to understanding some of the things that you're missing when you're listening and some of the things that you're catching on. All right. That's a great question, Antonio. Alana has asked, can you still gain information from information overload? Alana, yes, you can. But for all of us, we're different, but all of us have like a certain limit, right? Where if we hit that limit and it becomes too much information, information overload occurs, and then we kick into mindless listening very quickly. So it's not that we didn't get any information out of it. It's just once we hit our certain peak, or we fill up that layer of information, we just can't take in any more information. That's usually when we start missing bits and pieces of information. We might have, for example, been listening really well the first 5 minutes of a conversation, and then the person might be offering tons and tons of information in the next 10 minutes, and so you might remember the first 5 minutes because you were listening really well, but then in the last 10 minutes of the conversation where they're providing you lots of information, you might not remember it because it's information overload. Does that make sense? So you do get some information, just you might miss a lot because of information overload. So I hope that answers your question, Alana. Venora, when a person comes to us with a problem, given our tendencies to over-advise, how do we tell when someone actually wants advice versus is just speaking empathy? Venora, that's a great question, and that is where paraphrasing, empathizing, and or analyzing comes in. I would actually suggest analyzing for that. Let me go back to our analyzing slide. So we just talked about analyzing. And so if you're not sure, like, does someone want advice? Do they not want advice? So let's say they are talking to you, Venora, and they've been talking for 15, 20 minutes and then they kind of just stop. You can use that moment to provide an analysis where you say, hey, from what I'm getting, you just want me to listen. Is that right? Or you don't want me to give advice? Or is there something that I can say to kind of guide you in the right way? Or you just more so want me for support? That's a form of analysis where we're trying to offer an interpretation for someone, and offer some sort of objective understanding, right? I'm not saying that advice is better or listening is better. I'm offering you, Venora, the choice. Do you want me to listen, or do you want advice, or do you want both, right? And so, Venora, I would say analysis is the best solution to finding that out. So I would say, let that person speak whatever they need to speak, and then you provide that as a form of feedback, okay? Daniela has asked, what's the major difference between mindless listening and mindful listening? Daniela, the major difference is mindful listening is when you're giving your full cognitive attention to something. So you are completely focused and invested in the message that you are receiving. Mindless listening is when you are giving the appearance of listening, but you're not truly listening. So you might be off daydreaming, or you might be half listening. You might be paying attention to something else. You might be pretending like you're listening, like and giving those kind of nonverbal cues, but your brain cognitively is not there. And so that's the key difference. Is mindless listening has no mental investment in it. Alexis said, on information overload, I once had a teacher compare watching a movie to reading for class as a comparison. Do you think it's a valid comparison since you need to be able to recall lots of information? Hmm. So, Alexis, I think that what you're saying, let me provide a response to make sure that I understand your question. You say that your teacher has compared watching a movie to reading for class. I don't know if those are comparable because you might visually remember more from a movie than you would from a book. Because like let's say you're a visual learner, like I'm a big visual learner, so I probably would remember a movie far more than I would remember reading or listening to a lecture. So I don't know. I don't think it's a valid comparison. I do think it's like this. I think the concept of what your teacher is saying is that regardless of whether or not you read the chapter or watch a movie, you still have to get a lot of information, right? A movie is a lot of information, right? You have to know the plot, the character, all the stuff that's happening. So I think that that's, Alexis, what your teacher's trying to say is that it's kind of like watching a movie where you have to know all the details. I would say, though, that in my opinion, and this is an opinion, I'm going to clarify this is an opinion, it's not the same simply because we all have different learning styles. So some of us might do great with a movie, some of us might not. So I would say that reading for class is more like a marathon, right? It's like a little marathon where you got to go long distances to get to your goal of understanding the information. And so I would compare reading any chapter or going through class or going through semester as a marathon, not a sprint. Monica has asked, how can we show support and avoid saying, I told you so? What are some tips to show more empathy? Monica, I want to preface this by saying, I told you so is usually not a preferable response, because even if you're right, and I know it's like such an itching response to be like, I told you so, and I've been in a situation where I've told someone not to do something and then they did it and then they got, bad consequences out of it, and then they come to me and I say, I told you so, and I want to say that so badly. But we have to remember that as competent communicators, we have to say things that are effective and appropriate. And so saying I told you so isn't effective because it doesn't provide anything extra to the conversation, and it's not appropriate because we all know it's not what the person wants to hear in that moment, right? And so as competent communicators, because that comment does not match what a competent communicator should do, we should try to avoid it. And so to show more empathy, what you should do is ask them how they're feeling about it, ask them what they think caused it. And so maybe in that moment becomes a teaching moment where instead of saying I told you so, you can say, hey, where do you think this started, or what caused this, and how can we kind of move forward to make sure this doesn't happen again. That's a way to show empathy, like I care about what's going on with you, so I want to make sure this doesn't happen again. And so they might self-reflect and recognize, oh yeah, that thing you told me not to do, I did it, right? And so then you don't have to say I told you so, because you get them to admit, by guiding them, what you get them to admit what they could have done better, right? Or what they could have avoided doing. Sydney has asked, what's the difference between counterfeit questioning and ambushing? Counterfeit questions are when you are providing only just questions to try to force someone to say something, whereas ambushing is more providing aggressive comments based off of specific things that someone says. So you're selectively listening, but ambushing is selectively listening plus aggression, right? Where you are picking out things that they're saying and you're making them feel bad about it or stupid for saying it or whatever. So that's the biggest difference, Sydney, is that counterfeit questioning is usually a question because that person is trying to force you to say something, admit something, or guide or force you to bring the conversation in a different direction. Alexis asked, do you think it is possible to not bring in context from a previous argument? This implies to the example of significant others arguing constantly. No. Context can never be ripped out of anything. So no human beings can pretend that context isn't there. You can kind of act like it, but ultimately it's always going to kind of rear its ugly head and come out because context is so important. Let me give you an example. So let's say, this is a very negative example, but this is the only one I have now, Alexis, is let's say two people are dating, and I'll be one of them. So let's say I catch my significant other cheating on me, being not loyal to me, right? And so once I forgive that person, we continue dating. Even if it's 2 or 3 years down the line, if I catch that person speaking to a member of the opposite sex, so it's my boyfriend, if I catch him speaking to another girlfriend, texting another girl, let's say in the evening, I'm immediately going to be like, oh, is he cheating on me again? That's context, right? I can't forget how things have played out in the past, and how things have played out in the past will always kind of feed into the present and the future. So Alexis, it's very hard to completely get rid of context. You can have a conversation about it, Alexis, where you say, hey, look, I know we've been fighting a lot lately, and I would really like us to kind of have a clean, fresh start in this conversation. Do you think we could do that? And the other person might say, yeah, okay, let's try that out. And so that is maybe having a new clean slate, Alexis. But the fact that I still needed to say that, and I still needed to ask you, hey, I know we've been fighting, but can we please start off with a new clean slate? That recognizes that there's already a context of tension in the relationship. So context is always there. It's how you deal with it that is important. So you can't not bring the context in there. It's there. So you have to address it by either saying, we've been fighting a lot, or this has been really negative, or this has not been a good situation. Let's work to make it better by doing this. And so you address it directly and verbally that way. And so that's the way you can kind of maybe not get rid of it, but kind of put it aside where it doesn't affect your communication interactions as much, Alexis, but you can, it's definitely always going to be there. So I hope that clarifies it for you, Alexis. Brianna has asked, regarding the elements of understanding, the third element, the context of the message. Can I get some clarification? Great. So Brianna, context, as I've said before, is super important. And so if you don't know the context in which a message is being given to you, you don't fully understand the message. And context simply refers to the time, the place, the situation, all of the things that are going on in a given interaction. One example, let's say that you are fighting with your significant other. It is more okay for you to fight if you're home by yourself, because that context is okay. It's not, you're not going to get upset at them if they pick a fight with you at home, right? But let's say you guys are out with your friends at a bar or a restaurant hanging out, and then they pick a fight with you in front of your friends. That's a context issue that will feed into the problem, because you're like, whoa, you couldn't wait till we got home to talk about this. You have to talk about this, while I'm in front of my friends. So Brianna, context is time, is place, situation, emotions. It's all of the things that are not part of the communication interaction, but that will always affect the communication interaction, right? So like I said, imagine a fight at home versus fighting out in public. Those fights play out in different ways because the context makes them play out in different ways. Let me pick a not negative example. I know I'm doing a lot of like fights and negative examples. Let's talk about, for example, weddings. If you go to a wedding, for example, sorry, my dog is barking at the post office man. See the context, the post office man. If you go to a wedding, it's a very joyous occasion, right? It's very positive, and so it's okay for you to drink and dance and be loud and vivacious and excited, because the context for that allows that type of communication behavior to be socially okay. And so, Brianna, context is anything outside of the actual interaction between you and that person that affects the interaction itself. I hope that helps. Let me know if it doesn't. Super important. Daniela, Monica, Sydney, Alana, Antonio, great questions. Thank you. I'm going to wait for Brianna just to make sure that you understand context a little bit more, because it's super important. So Brianna, if I get the okay from you, I'll go ahead and close out lecture today. Are we good on context? I will check right now the quiz, Benora. Okay, cool. And Brianna, I mean, if anyone needs more help on context, let me know. I know it's very difficult to understand because it's like this abstract idea. It's not something that you can actually grasp, like it's a thing that you can hold, right? Context is kind of everywhere. Awesome. So thank you everybody for being here. Have a wonderful rest of your Tuesday. Best of luck on everything. I'll be reading your nonverbal papers this week, so I'm super excited for that. Have a fantastic day, and I will see you all next week for my lectures next week, okay? Bye.